In 1913, Václav Nijinsky and Igor Stravinsky's production, The Rite of Spring, premiered in Paris, where its primitive expressionism and bizarre choreography provoked conflict between both the general public and the ballet community. However, in the following decades, this outdated understanding of expression was adapted and replaced by new and experimental ideas, a compromise which changed the direction of music and art forever. The Rite of Spring, a prelude to modern expression.
Igor Fedorovich Stravinsky was born in 1882 in Russia. With both parents in the musical industry, he was introduced to both musical and theatrical worlds early in his life. Stravinsky quickly developed an interest in music and showed his earliest pieces to renowned composer Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. Like most composers at the time, Rimsky-Korsakov was quite traditional when it came to music. Before 1850, most music consisted of distinct melodies that conformed with the traditional view of art. But when he saw the experimental nature that Stravinsky had, he was immediately impressed, guiding the young musician and letting Stravinsky experiment with new musical ideas.
Stravinsky was inspired by earlier artists, such as French Impressionists Claude Debussy and Maurice Ravel. Debussy's last work, Jeux, created a slight twist to classical music, but was nothing compared to what Stravinsky had in mind. During this time, the age of traditional music was coming to an end. This specific transition from defined to abstract was occurring in painting as well. Revolutionary artists emerged during this turn of the century. New painters brought in new genres from the painting world, and they used elements from older styles, but molded them into something entirely new. Stravinsky's goals reflected those of Pablo Picasso, arguably the most influential artist of the 20th century.
Stravinsky's earliest works were played in small concerts and recitals, and it was around this time when Sergei Diaghilev, the founder of the ballet company Ballet Russes, found the young musician. Their collaborations brought forth Stravinsky's most famous pieces, including The Firebird, Petrushka, and finally, The Rite of Spring.
Through the Ballet Russes, Stravinsky worked with Russian choreographer Václav Nijinsky to create the ballet. Whilst composing The Rite of Spring and working with Nijinsky, Stravinsky described his inspiration for the ballet as the mystery and the great surge of creative power of spring in pagan Russia, a time of sacred, cultic traditions. He dreamt to capture the raw and primitive spirit of these pagan rituals, composing with vivid, fierce expressions. The Rite of Spring was an exploration into new musical ideas, which only added to the intensity of the ballet. These techniques included bitonality, writing music in two keys at once, polyrhythmic ostinatos, and other radical concepts. The score was once thought of as one of the most complex musical scores ever written.
Nijinsky's choreography also reflected the primal and almost satanic elements of the piece. His dance was said to have even a greater controversy than the musical composition itself. Dancers created strange movements resembling primitive sacrifices, and unlike other ballets at the time, such as the Nutcracker, the Rite of Spring was dark, both visually and aurally.
The dancing was primitive, it was ugly looking, it put bodies into unusual, unnatural positions. Everything you expect of ballet in terms of point work and balance was thrown out the window.
These strange qualities of the ballet are not without reason. The story depicts Russians enacting an unholy sacrifice of a virgin girl in order to bring the sun back to the land and restore peace. The theme of the work seemed to be of sacrificing the individual for the community, even if the means are bloody. Through modern analysis, it has been tied to a new political mindset of the time, communism, defined as economic and social system in which all, or nearly all, property and resources are collectively owned by a classless society and not by individual citizens. This message shows the changing of ideologies during that time. It was May 29, 1913, when the world premiere of The Rite took Paris by storm. Labeled the Rite of Spring Riot, the controversial ballet sparked a great uproar of clamor and turbulence. Multiple accounts have described the night as being terribly chaotic and noisy. Brawls occurred in the stands while the orchestra struggled to concentrate on their notes, and unhappy audience members lobbed objects onto the stage. Even Stravinsky himself admitted that the entire scene was a mess, recalling that the conductor had to shout out rehearsal numbers to keep the dancers and orchestra in sync.
It was full of very noisy public. I went out, I said, go to hell. Excuse me, Miss Gaydon.
Reviews from the critics shortly after the premiere were mostly negative, such as the one published by Henri Catard of the French newspaper Le Figaro. Here is a strange spectacle of a laborious imperial barbarity which the audience of the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées received without respect, and we are sorry to see an artist such as Mr. Stravinsky involve himself in this disconcerting adventure, from whom music, after The Firebird or Petrushka, could have expected further beautiful works. Some thought that the piece just wasn't performed well, like Michael Dmitry Kavakoresi, a renowned critic of Russian music. The idea was excellent, but it was not successfully carried out. However, although most reviews were negative, there are some outliers. For example, Gustave Lenor, who was a critic of a leading theatrical magazine, Comedia, wrote that the performance was superb, especially that of Maria Pilz. The disturbances, while deplorable, were merely a rowdy debate between two ill-mannered factions. With all that said and done, how could a single ballet cause such an outrageous response from the audience? The main dispute was that there was simply a disagreement of ideas. It was a conflict between the traditional and the experimental, people who were open to new forms of music and people who weren't. The Rite of Spring was presented as a scandal, and the horrible acts that were shown in the ballet struck an unwelcome chord in the minds of the audience.
News about the riot spread around the world like wildfire. In coverage by the Macon Telegraph, people described the premiere as strange and horrendously modern. In this ballet of pagan Russia, there is no dancing in the ordinary sense of the word, but groups of performers go through certain movements which suggest certain ideas. Nijinsky's choreography, although it produced some clever effects at times, is apparently nothing but aimless movements.
The public had reacted dramatically, and for a while, the Rite of Spring was known as a catastrophic mistake. However, this view on the Rite of Spring was not permanent, as it was replaced by new ideas, and a compromise that took place over the early 20th century. There were enthusiasts who appreciated its expert composition and original execution. This idea of accepting the new was shared by many modernists, and by the time it was performed in London, there were no hisses nor boos. One review in 1930 by critic A.M. Gordon stated that its elemental brutality and primitive savagery have caused great offense to many people, but whether or not one admires the mentality of the perpetrator of such musical barbarianism, one cannot deny its perfection of realistic expression and complete originality of exposition. This was a compromise forged through the changing of ideas about music and expression over many years, not by a single event or person.
What seemed to be a vulgar, chaotic spectacle. Once people got used to it, got used to the sound, once people understood what the creative impulse was and what intellectually as well as physically the inventors were trying to actually establish, it was completely unprecedented. It was so radically new, that it really defines the word genius.
It pioneered the use of complex musical ideas and gave rise to what is now known as modernist music. According to The Guardian, some of the score's most electrifying moments come when opposed rhythmical strands are piled on top of one another. Such superimpositions amount to a musical collage, creating a form of highly organized chaos. This was the expansion of polyrhythm, one of modern music's most essential innovations, way beyond anything conceived before. The Rite of Spring also influenced composers and their works. For example, Karl Orff, the composer of Carmina Burana, stated that he took inspiration from Stravinsky's pieces. Edgard Varese also took inspiration from the Rite, composing Octandre a decade later. The Rite of Spring was also included in part of Disney's Fantasia, which used parts of the music as a background to a scene portraying the extinction of the dinosaurs. Also, many groups today still experiment with its choreography, with new ideas on how to express these pagan acts. Not only has the Rite of Spring affected entertainment, but it has also changed how political beliefs are expressed through a creative medium. The Rite of Spring was an allusion to the communist ideology, and it expressed a forewarning for what the world might have succumbed to. Political stances were strong in the early 20th century, and the seemingly chaotic noise of the Rite drew a parallel to the political turmoil present at the time.
Though the works of Stravinsky and Nijinsky conflicted with the traditional mindset of that era, they ultimately sparked a compromise, shaping the development of modern expression and changing how art is perceived for eras to come.